They said they couldn't spare $6,000 for my heart surgery. A week later, I saw them dancing on a cruise ship, celebrating family after spending 31,000. I stood in my kitchen, heart aching louder than any diagnosis, watching the live stream. I knew then that family wasn't who you raised, it was who stood beside you when you were drowning. And in that silence, I chose to rise, but not the way they thought I would. I sold my house the same week the cardiologist confirmed what I already feared, not because I wanted to, because I had no other choice. The left side of my heart was failing. Quietly, steadily. The kind of silent betrayal that doesn't scream but whispers in the background until you're too tired to argue. The house had been mine for over 30 years. A quiet corner in a quiet neighborhood, warm maple floors, a garden Leo and I built with our hands. Wesley grew up there. Sasha got engaged in the backyard under the peach tree. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning, handed over the keys, and told myself it was worth it. For them. They had moved in with me after Leo passed. Said it would be good for everyone. They would save for their future. I would have company. Sasha said I wouldn't have to face grief alone. And I didn't. Not really. I just faced something colder. I cooked. I cleaned. I helped raise their daughter, Ava. I stayed silent when Sasha repainted my dining room white and called it minimal. I smiled when she took over the living room with her microphones and lighting kits. She called it content creation. I called it being invisible. When the surgeon said the procedure would cost 6,000, I wasn't afraid. I had enough from the sale. Not much more, but just enough. I didn't even plan to tell them, just quietly schedule the surgery and recover. Then Sasha came into my room with her voice lowered, her eyes soft like she was breaking bad news to a neighbor. She said now might not be the time. Maybe we should wait and explore natural remedies. Lemon water, yoga, more sleep, less salt. She mentioned Ava's braces and how expensive life was getting. She smiled, said I looked strong. That I was strong. Wesley didn't come in, didn't say a word, just let her speak for both of them. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and Leo's photo. I didn't cry. My chest ached, but not from the diagnosis. From something deeper, lonelier, something that felt like being erased. The next morning, I overheard Sasha talking on a call. She stood by the kitchen island, laptop open, laughing, planning something. A family cruise, she said, motivational workshops, matching shirts, legacy dinners, the retreat of a lifetime, $31,000. Family is everything, she said. Family deserves to be celebrated. I stood in the hallway, one hand on the wall, steadying myself. I wasn't sure what hurt more. The money, the lies, or the way they spoke about family like I wasn't even part of it. That afternoon I searched for the event. There it was. Real. Glossy. Hashtags and live streams scheduled. They would broadcast it to the world. The perfect family. Unity. Celebration. That evening, I cancelled my next appointment. Sasha smiled and said it was probably for the best. Timing is everything, she said. Later that night, when they went out to dinner, I walked into Sasha's podcast room. The phone was still on the tripod, open to her content calendar. Next week's theme, the power of honesty. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. I just stood there, staring at the screen, feeling something shift inside me. A heaviness lifted. A silence cracked. To anyone listening now, maybe you've felt it too. That moment when the people you trusted start treating you like a shadow in your own life. That was the moment I realized something. My story wasn't theirs to finish. And I wasn't done yet. 2 days after I cancelled my appointment, Sasha posted a video. She stood on the deck of the cruise ship, ocean behind her, wind in her hair. Her voice was smooth and polished. She talked about resilience, about choosing joy over fear, about breaking generational cycles. I watched the video from the quiet of my room, the volume low. Ava sat beside me, drawing flowers with a green crayon on the back of an old envelope. I looked at her soft curls, the way her tongue stuck out slightly when she focused, and I thought about what kind of example I was setting. I had given too much, not just money, space, time, myself. That night, they came home late. Sasha smelled like champagne and sea breeze. Wesley looked sunburned and tired. They barely said a word to me before heading to their room. I stayed in the kitchen, putting away groceries I had ordered myself. I moved quietly now, like background noise. In the middle of the night, I woke with chest tightness, not from the heart condition, from something colder. I went to the kitchen and stood by the sink, watching the moonlight filter through the window. I felt a calm settle over me, but not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes before a decision is made. By morning, I had already started packing. Not clothes, not dishes, papers, receipts, copies of the home sale, printouts from Sasha's online store. I had seen it before but never looked closely. Turns out, Sasha was selling self-help kits, journals, motivational downloads, subscription boxes filled with candles and herbal teas, the same ones I had been buying for her at the grocery store. I found invoices, real ones. Her brand made over 50,000 last quarter. She had used my kitchen to build it, my living room as her studio, my Wi-Fi, my time watching Ava. And now, she was selling content about family loyalty and elder respect, while quietly dismissing mine. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I just began to take notes. At noon, she asked if I could pick up Ava from daycare because she had a branding call. I smiled and said yes. Ava liked it when I picked her up. On the way home, we stopped at the park. I sat on the bench while she chased ducks. I kept looking at the trees, thinking how long they took to grow. Later that night, Sasha asked if I could also prep lunch for the next day. She had a big interview, something about a podcast network. I agreed again, quietly. But I also called Diane. Diane was never loud, never nosy. She had been my neighbor for over 20 years before moving across town to help her daughter. We still talked once a month. She knew my voice well enough to tell something was off. I asked if she was busy the next morning. She wasn't. I said I needed a second pair of eyes on something. When she arrived, I laid everything out on the table. She didn't say much at first, just looked. She saw the income, the business registrations, the brand slogans that mirrored things I had said over the years. I watched her face carefully. Her eyes hardened slowly. "This isn't just emotional, Eleanor," she said. "This is financial." She asked me one thing. "Do you want to disappear quietly, or do you want to reappear on your own terms?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the sunlight coming through the window and felt it on my hands. For the first time in a long while, I imagined what it would feel like to live somewhere I wasn't tolerated, but celebrated, not needed, not used, just wanted. By the end of the day, Diane had connected me with a lawyer, a quiet woman named Karen who didn't ask unnecessary questions. She listened. She took notes. She asked for copies. I handed them over one by one, and with each paper, each screenshot, each forgotten invoice, I felt something lift. Not anger, not revenge, just the first layer of a plan. A plan I didn't need to announce, one I would let unfold, one quiet step at a time. That night I made dinner like usual. I set the table, I smiled when Sasha complimented the seasoning. I nodded when Wesley asked about the mail. I was invisible, but I had never been more aware. Not of them, of me. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay there, steady, eyes open, heart beating slowly, and imagined the sound of doors unlocking. Not theirs. Mine. The next week, the weather turned. Wind moved through the neighborhood like a warning. Leaves rattled against the windows, and the branches tapped the glass as if asking to be let in. I stood at the sink, washing dishes, while Sasha recorded upstairs. Her voice drifted through the vents, polished, cheerful, selling a version of herself I no longer recognized. By then, the lawyer had all the documents she needed. Karen worked efficiently. Her voice was calm, measured. She never asked why I waited so long, never once commented on the cruelty hidden behind Sasha's curated posts. Instead, she pointed out the paper trail. Every borrowed dollar, every transfer, every payment labeled as reimbursement for groceries, childcare, utilities, but never repaid. She said the case would take time. That was fine. I had lived in silence for years. I could wait a few weeks more. At home, I kept moving. Sasha started preparing for their next family cruise. She called it a retreat. Wesley didn't argue. He rarely did. He looked tired, more often now. I noticed his shoulders hunched when Sasha gave him directions. He spent hours in the garage under the guise of organizing, but I knew it was just his escape. Same way mine used to be the garden. One night, I walked out to the garage and found him sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the shelves. He looked up when I came in and offered a faint smile. He said he missed how things used to be. I nodded but said nothing. That silence felt truer than any words. Later that evening, while Sasha was live streaming, I sat in my room and opened a box I had buried at the back of my closet. Inside were letters, receipts from Leo's insurance, old photos of Wesley when he used to laugh with his whole face. I found a journal from 10 years ago. I had stopped writing in it when Sasha moved in. Flipping through, I found an entry where I had written, "I feel like I am slowly becoming a guest in my own life." I closed the journal. Not with sadness, with certainty. The next morning, I packed Ava's lunch like usual. Sasha had an influencer meetup across town and needed the whole day. She asked if I could also record a few voice samples for her new audiobook on family values. Her voice was flat when she said it, like she didn't hear the weight of her own request. I told her I'd think about it. Instead, I sat in the garden with Ava and read to her from a book Leo used to love. The wind moved through the trees and she leaned against me quietly. For a while, it felt like time paused. Then the mail arrived. One envelope stood out, cream-colored, thick paper. Karen's handwriting. Inside, a breakdown of our case so far, copies of the financial reports, a list of accounts in Sasha's name tied to my former assets. It was the first time I saw it all in one place, $93,000. That was the value of what I had quietly given over the years, not including the house, not including time. I placed the papers back into the envelope, then slid it under the mattress. The next day, I woke up early and made pancakes. Sasha came down with her laptop in one hand and her phone in the other. She kissed Ava on the forehead but didn't look at me. She asked if I had thought about recording those samples. I said no, but I'd written something for her instead. She blinked but didn't respond. I handed her a single sheet of paper. On it were 5 lines, a statement, not a script. She skimmed it, then asked what it was. I said nothing. She set the paper down and left the kitchen. That evening, I emailed Karen and said I was ready to proceed publicly if needed, not for exposure, not for punishment, but because silence was a shield I no longer needed. The next morning, Diane drove me to a small rental apartment across town. Nothing fancy. A little second-floor unit with a view of the park. It wasn't home yet, but it would be. Inside, I unpacked only two things: my kettle and the photo of Leo. That afternoon, I sent Wesley a message. Just a few words. I'm safe. Take care of Ava. He didn't respond, but I saw the message marked as read. The cruise went on. Sasha posted photos of sunrises and matching swimsuits. Her captions talked about healing and legacy, but one photo caught my eye. She stood at the edge of the boat, holding Ava's hand. Ava wasn't smiling. Her eyes looked past the camera, unfocused, distant. That was the last photo I saw before Sasha locked her account. Back in my apartment, I made tea and sat by the window. Across the street, a young couple laughed as they unloaded groceries. Their movements were easy, unpracticed, real. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just sat in that quiet room, surrounded by nothing I didn't choose. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel erased. I felt present, fully. The night I left, I didn't pack much. Just one suitcase with essentials, some folded papers in a folder, and my grandmother's necklace wrapped in a towel. I walked out the door the same way I had walked into it 15 years ago, quietly, unnoticed. The sun had already dipped behind the houses. Sasha was in her studio. I could hear her practicing a new segment, something about gratitude. Wesley was upstairs. Ava was at her piano lesson. I didn't leave a note. I didn't want drama, just distance. I had arranged everything with Diane the day before. She had insisted I take her guest room until I found something more permanent. When I walked into her house, she didn't say much. She made me tea and handed me the key. The quiet between us felt like healing. She didn't ask what happened. She just gave me space. For the first few days, I slept more than I expected. My body was lighter, my heart still weak, but no longer pulled in 1,000 directions. The silence wasn't lonely. It was necessary. I read. I watered Diane's plants. I took slow walks. But my mind kept working. Karen, my lawyer, called on the fourth morning. She had the documentation in place, the trust amendment, the withdrawal of Sasha and Wesley as beneficiaries, the shift of ownership for the last savings I hadn't told them about. The funds from the house sale had been partially rerouted into a medical trust in my name. The rest sat in a newly created account under the Lorraine Finch Foundation. That name made me smile. Not because I wanted attention, but because it finally belonged to me. On the 7th day, I put on one of my older blazers and took the bus downtown. The air smelled like roasted chestnuts from a vendor near the corner. I walked into a small conference room on the 3rd floor of the community center. The table was already set. Karen was there, calm as ever. Across from her sat Miss Delgado, the director of the local women's initiative. We signed the partnership in less than 30 minutes. The Lorraine Finch Foundation would begin by funding 10 scholarships for women over 50 pursuing trade certifications. Electricians, mechanics, culinary arts, not charity, dignity, the kind of help that could not be twisted into social media content. After we shook hands, I sat in the coffee shop nearby with a blueberry scone and a notebook. I opened a fresh page and wrote one sentence. This is what legacy actually looks like. Back at Diane's that evening, the phone rang. She answered, then handed it to me. It was Wesley. His voice sounded off, like someone who had been looking for something and couldn't find it. He said Ava had asked where Grandma went. I said I was safe. He said Sasha thought I had been feeling overwhelmed, that I should have told them if I needed space. I listened. Then I told him this was not about needing space. This was about needing self-respect. He didn't argue. I hung up before it got messy. The next morning, Sasha posted a video titled "The Cost of Sacrifice." It was 23 minutes of curated sorrow. She cried, talked about family, about absence. She didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. I was the absence. The comments flooded in. "You're so strong. They don't deserve you. Family is who shows up." For a moment, I felt like maybe I should respond. But then I remembered what Diane had said when we were in her garden that afternoon. Let them talk. You're finally living. The next step wasn't easy. I had asked Karen to organize a quiet announcement. Nothing flashy, just a local notice for the launch of the foundation, and a small note submitted to the paper that Wesley and Sasha subscribed to. Buried between articles on upcoming town hall meetings and recipes for apple pie, there it would sit. A photo of me smiling. A short paragraph. Lorraine Finch, former community cook and volunteer coordinator, announces the launch of a Women's Dignity Fund to support trades training for underserved women over 50, funded in full from the sale of her home and personal assets. No drama, just facts. That evening, Sasha tried to call me. I didn't pick up. Then she emailed. She asked if we could meet. Said she missed me. Said Ava cried when she saw my chair empty. I stared at the message for a long time. I believed the part about Ava, not the rest. I wrote back 3 words. I need time. And then I closed the laptop, made myself a sandwich, and watched the news. That night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't hear the sound of someone else's voice filling a house that never felt like mine. I heard only the wind brushing against the window, and for the first time, that sound didn't scare me. It sounded like freedom. The next few weeks unfolded in a way that reminded me of a slow tide, quiet at first, then shifting everything beneath the surface. Life at Diane's felt steady. Each morning began with coffee on the back porch, her golden retriever curled near my feet, the garden humming with the sounds of late summer. I spent more time with my thoughts than I ever had before. I didn't feel lost. I felt suspended, like the world had paused long enough for me to finally see the outline of my own life. For decades, I had moved for everyone else. Now, every step was mine alone. The foundation officially launched the following Monday. Karen sent a photo of the front page of the local section. I was wearing my old navy sweater in the picture. My smile was small, but real. I forwarded it to no one, just saved it in my phone. A quiet reminder that some parts of me were still intact. The first scholarship applicants were already reaching out. One woman, a 55-year-old former nurse, wanted to train in appliance repair. Another, recently widowed, hoped to pursue culinary work. These women reminded me of myself. They weren't asking for a rescue, just a fair chance to begin again. One afternoon, I was helping Diane fold laundry when she mentioned the city was hosting a small business fair in 2 weeks. She suggested I set up a booth for the foundation. At first, I hesitated. That wasn't my world. But something inside nudged me forward. 2 Saturdays later, I stood behind a folding table covered with pamphlets and a modest sign. Lorraine Finch Foundation. Nothing flashy, just blue ink on white canvas. I didn't expect much. But as the hours passed, a steady stream of women stopped by. Some curious, some cautious, some ready. I watched their eyes as they read the flyers. The same flicker of doubt. Then the quiet blooming of possibility. One woman whispered that she had nearly given up. Another took a pen and said she hadn't written her own name on anything important in years. It moved something deep in me. After the event, I rode the bus back to Diane's and stared out the window. The streets glowed in the fading gold of evening, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a guest in my own body. I felt like a woman returning. That night, Sasha posted another video. This one was different. No tears, just a message about reflection, rebuilding, and letting go of expectations. She still didn't mention me, but there were hints. A photo of Ava holding a drawing that looked suspiciously like me, a story about a grandmother who always made lemon tea. People in the comments caught on. They asked where I was, why I had vanished, whether everything was okay. Sasha didn't respond, and that silence said more than anything. 2 days later, Diane handed me an envelope that had arrived in her mailbox. My name was printed in Wesley's handwriting. Inside was a simple card. No flowers, no signature, just a single sentence. Ava misses you. I stared at it for a long time, then folded it in half and placed it in the back of my journal. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't ready. Later that week, Diane and I attended a community dinner at the women's shelter we had supported. They gave me a seat near the window, next to a woman named Teresa, who was about to graduate from a plumbing program. She had tears in her eyes as she spoke. She said the scholarship made her feel visible again, like someone had finally looked past her mistakes and seen the woman underneath. I held her hand as she spoke. I didn't give her advice. I just listened. That night, back at Diane's, I stood at the sink washing the few dishes we used. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes with healing, not absence, the kind of quiet I used to fear. Now, I welcomed it. I looked around at the small things, the fridge with magnets shaped like birds, the calendar filled with Diane's careful handwriting, the slippers by the door. Nothing expensive, nothing dramatic, but real. For once, I wasn't performing strength. I was simply living it. In the dark, I sat on the porch and watched the sky fade from deep blue to almost black. A car passed now and then, but mostly the world had settled. And so had I. I wasn't done grieving, or healing, or learning, but I was no longer waiting to be seen. I had already found my reflection, not in a screen, not in a live stream, but in the eyes of the women who showed up at that folding table and asked if it was too late to start again. I had told each of them the same thing. No, it is never too late. And now, finally, I believed it for myself too. The air shifted not with sound, but with sensation. It was a Tuesday when the quiet of Diane's kitchen was interrupted by the hum of her phone. She handed it to me without a word, the screen showing a text from Wesley. It was a forwarded invitation. Ava's school had organized a grandparents' appreciation event. Each student was allowed to invite one grandparent to spend the day with them, share lunch, and talk about family traditions. My chest tightened. I hadn't been called a grandmother in months. I hadn't heard Ava say my name since the day I walked away. But there it was, a note beneath the invitation. Ava asked for you. There was no apology, no long message, just that. Diane waited while I read it again. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. She told me not to answer right away. Let the feeling settle first, then decide. For the rest of the day, I was still in body, but not in mind. The memory of Ava's drawings, her voice calling out for bedtime stories, her small hands tracing circles on my arm, it all returned. Grief didn't knock anymore. It slipped through cracks you forgot to seal. That evening, I sat at the edge of the porch, fingers laced tightly, the ache of indecision pressing at my ribs. Diane brought out a cup of lemon tea. The scent alone unraveled something in me. I told her everything. About the last day I saw Ava. About how Sasha had closed the door without turning around. About how Wesley stood in the hallway, eyes down, mouth shut. About the silence that had followed, as though I had been erased, not lost. Diane listened, as she always did. Then she said something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. Maybe Ava remembers more than they think. Maybe this invitation wasn't from Wesley. Maybe it was from her. That night, I didn't sleep much. But in the morning, I got dressed. I didn't respond to the text. I didn't call. I didn't send a message through Diane. I simply showed up at the school office 20 minutes before the event began. The receptionist looked surprised but didn't stop me. She pointed toward the auditorium. Rows of chairs, student art hung across the walls, small tables set up with paper crowns and plastic tea sets. It smelled like crayons and cafeteria cookies. And there she was. Ava, her hair a little longer, her eyes the same. She was standing near a poster about her family tree, holding a cardboard sign that read, "My grandma's favorite song is," and the rest was blank. When she saw me, her face didn't light up. She didn't run across the room. She froze. Then, slowly, she smiled. A small, unsure smile. I walked to her, heart pounding in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. I knelt beside her and looked at the sign. She handed me a marker. I wrote Moon River. She nodded. Then she whispered something I wasn't sure I heard right. "I missed you." We didn't talk about the live stream, or the scholarship, or the things adults say and forget that children remember. We just sat together. At lunch, she offered me half her cookie. I took it. An hour later, I slipped out before Sasha and Wesley arrived. It wasn't about hiding. It was about protecting something fragile. Some moments aren't meant to be explained, just felt. When I returned to Diane's, she didn't ask what happened. She just made space on the couch, handed me a blanket, and turned on the kettle. That night, I added something new to the Foundation's website. A section called Letters to Grandmothers, a space for women to write notes to the grandkids they couldn't see. A place to say what had been left unsaid. To tell stories, share memories, say they were still here, still loving. The first letter was mine. It began with Dear Ava, and it ended with, "Still your Moon River grandma." No signature, just truth. And that was enough. The morning after I published the first letter on the Foundation website, I received 7 messages before noon. Some came from women I knew from the neighborhood. Others were strangers. But every single one of them began the same way. I thought I was the only one. Each message carried a weight. Some wrote about not being able to see their grandchildren after a divorce. Others spoke about silence that came after a family disagreement. A few were simply unsure what they had done to deserve the distance. By the end of the week, there were over 40 letters posted. Each woman poured herself onto the screen, into the quiet corners of a website built from my grief. There were no replies, no debates, no corrections. Just truth. I wasn't prepared for the way it changed me. Each night, I read a few letters before bed. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I smiled. Sometimes I just sat with the words until the silence around them softened. It reminded me that pain doesn't isolate, it connects. That weekend, Diane and I drove to a small community center on the other side of town. A local librarian had seen the site and wanted to host a reading circle. She offered a quiet room, a kettle, and a small tray of store-bought lemon cookies. There were only 6 of us that first meeting. One woman, Virginia, had lost contact with her grandsons after her son remarried. Another, Martha, had been caring for her daughter through addiction and hadn't seen her granddaughter in years. Each woman arrived carrying something heavy but invisible, and for the first time in a long time, we put words to it. I didn't plan to speak, but I found myself sharing what happened at the school with Ava. I didn't describe it as a turning point. I didn't call it forgiveness. I just said it was a moment I wouldn't trade. The other women nodded, not because they had the same moment, but because they understood its worth. We decided to meet once a month. I drove home with the windows slightly open, letting the wind carry away what it could. That night, I added another section to the website, the gathering table, a virtual map where women could post locations for coffee meetups, porch conversations, quiet walks. It wasn't about solving anything. It was about being seen. The response was quiet but steady. 3 weeks later, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a printed photo. It was Ava, sitting on a porch, holding a small sign that read, "I picked Moon River for Music Day. No note, just the photo." I stared at it for a long time. Then I framed it and placed it on the shelf near the kitchen window. Diane came in, saw it, and nodded once. Neither of us said anything, but I knew she understood what it meant. Some messages don't need explanation. Later that month, I was invited to speak at a local non-profit summit. Someone had found the website, read the letters, and believed it was worth sharing. I hesitated. I wasn't a speaker. I didn't have bullet points or charts. But I had the letters, and I had the voice of a woman who had nearly disappeared in her own life. So I said yes. The night before the summit, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, rehearsing my words. I didn't want to talk about loss. I wanted to talk about what remains, about dignity, about memory, about what it means to keep loving even when you're no longer called by name. The morning of the talk, I wore the blue scarf Ava once gave me for Christmas. I didn't bring notes. I just stood at the podium and told the truth. I told them about selling my house, about the surgery, about watching a live stream where my family celebrated everything I had once given them. And then I told them what happened after. The quiet, the rebuilding, the letters. When I finished, there was silence. Then applause. Not loud, not thunderous, but sincere. Several women came up afterward. Some hugged me. One gave me a folded note that said, "Thank you for not giving up." Another simply said, "I see you." On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, as if the earth beneath me had shifted slightly, enough to hold me better. When we pulled into the driveway, Diane reached over and turned off the engine. She looked at me and said one sentence, "You're not invisible anymore." I didn't reply. I just nodded and opened the door. The wind carried in the scent of rain. It smelled like change. It was early April when the email came in. The subject line was simple: Family Surgery Fund Follow-up. I opened it without much thought, assuming it was another support request or maybe a thank you from someone who had found comfort in the letters on the site. But it wasn't from a stranger. It was from an old neighbor, Penny Walters, who used to live 2 streets over. Her daughter and my Jonah had been in the same grade once. We hadn't spoken in years. She wrote carefully, like someone trying to balance on a wire. She said she had seen the live stream from our family's Yosemite trip, said she'd recognized Amelia in the background, and then, through a friend, had learned that a fundraiser had once been set up for Jonah's surgery. She said it made her feel sick. Then she asked if I had ever seen the public comments Amelia and Carson had made on the fundraiser after I closed it. I hadn't. I clicked on the link she included, and it brought me to a cached version of the page. There were 2 comments from Carson's profile. both dated 2 weeks after I had pulled the campaign down. The first one read, "We appreciate the community support, but my mother-in-law exaggerated the urgency. My son is doing just fine. We'd prefer to handle things privately moving forward." The second said, "Please don't send more donations. This isn't an emergency." I sat back, the air leaving my chest in one slow release. I had known they were careless, even unkind. But to publicly frame my concern for Jonah as an exaggeration, to dismiss the reality of his condition as though I had imagined it, that was something else entirely. I closed the browser and stood up. My legs ached. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood there in silence, staring out at the small lemon tree I had planted after I moved in. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called my lawyer. Her name was Isabel Tran. We had met during the early days of setting up the foundation. I trusted her, not just with the technicalities, but with the intentions behind them. She knew I didn't want revenge. I just wanted truth. She answered after 2 rings. By the time I finished explaining what I had found, she was already typing. She asked if I had saved screenshots. I said yes. She told me to email them over. Then she said something that struck me. "Let's make sure their version of the story isn't the one history remembers." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. The next few days were a blur of communication. Isabel reached out to a media outlet that had covered our community foundation launch earlier in the year. The journalist, a woman named Shayla Diaz, remembered me. She said she was interested in doing a feature. Not about me. About the erasure of women's stories inside families. About financial gaslighting. About the way older women are often written out of the narrative, especially when money and legacy are involved. We recorded the interview 2 days later. I didn't cry during it. I didn't rant. I just told the truth. About the surgery. About the fundraiser. About watching them spend more on a vacation than they had been willing to spend on their own son's health. The piece ran the following week. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't mean. But it was honest. And the quotes from Amelia and Carson's old fundraiser were included, alongside a statement from the pediatrician I had taken Jonah to before everything collapsed. The response was quiet at first. Then it grew, not in the form of clicks or shares, but in the form of more letters. This time, women began writing about being cut off from decisions in their families, about being told they were confused or outdated, about watching as their own sons and daughters rewrote memories they had lived firsthand. One letter said, "My son told people I had dementia because I didn't agree with selling the house." Another said, "I watched my daughter-in-law explain to a nurse that I was just a former grandmother. I created a new section on the site. The unwritten, a space for stories about being silenced, overwritten, or erased. It filled faster than I expected. Diane suggested we print a small anthology, just for the women in our circle at first. Then, maybe, for the local libraries, a physical record, a ledger of what was once invisible." The week after the article went live, I received a short letter in the mail. No return address. Just 3 words on the front of the envelope. I still remember. Inside was a note. The handwriting was Carson's. It said, "I didn't know she would post that. I didn't know until too late." I folded the letter and placed it inside a book on my shelf. I didn't need to reply. Some acknowledgements come too late to matter. But I kept it, not for comfort, but for clarity. I didn't need justice to be loud. I just needed it to exist. That night, I walked to the garden and sat beside the lemon tree. The air was thick with the smell of earth and rain. I looked up and saw the stars beginning to push through the dusk. I whispered one sentence to the sky. "I am not gone." And for the first time in years, I believed it. It was late spring when the invitation arrived. A thick cream envelope with gold embossed lettering, Carson's handwriting. Inside was a formal invitation to a dinner at their home, addressed to me by full name. No mum, just Ms. Madeline Rourke. The date was set for a Saturday evening in early May. No occasion noted, just a short line at the bottom. We would love for you to join us for an evening of reconnection and reflection. I sat with it for a while, letting the corners of the paper press into my fingertips. It had been months since the article, since the fundraiser exposure, since I had seen Jonah in person. Amelia had stopped responding to the foundation updates. I hadn't heard Carson's voice since the night he left me at the clinic. I wasn't naive. I knew this was no olive branch. But curiosity has a strange way of circling back in the form of courage. Or maybe I just needed to look them in the eye one last time. I wore navy, simple slacks and a blouse I had kept from the days I ran orientation at the museum. Something clean, steady. I drove myself, arriving at exactly 6. Their house looked different. The front yard was newly landscaped. The porch lights glowed a warm amber, the same lights Carson once called too much. Everything now looked curated for appearance, not comfort. Amelia greeted me at the door with a practiced smile. She was wearing pearls and soft makeup, the kind you wear for magazine covers or press releases. She offered wine, but I declined. Inside, the dining table was set for 6. There was Jonah, fidgeting beside his cousin Miles. Across from them sat Carson's boss, a man named Greg, whom I had met once years ago at a holiday party. Next to him, his wife, a woman with perfect posture and empty eyes. It didn't take long for me to realize this wasn't about family. This was a show. I took my seat and listened as Carson bragged about the foundation gala they were planning. Amelia dropped hints about a family legacy in philanthropy. Jonah barely said a word. He played with the corner of his napkin, his eyes darting between me and his plate. The first course came and went, then the second. By dessert, Greg leaned back and said, "It's remarkable what you two have built. And I must say, your mother-in-law's early involvement really gave the whole project a heartwarming start." Amelia tilted her head and gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Madeline was very generous in those first few months. But as the foundation matured, we felt it was important to streamline the leadership structure. Carson nodded. It became necessary to realign the brand, especially after some confusion with the media. I didn't respond. I simply placed my fork down, folded my napkin slowly, and looked toward Jonah. His lip trembled. I knew that look. He wanted to speak, but he wouldn't. Not here. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small folder. Inside was a single-page statement. The press team from Shayla's article had offered to publish it earlier, but I had declined at the time. I was waiting. Tonight felt like the moment. I passed it across the table to Greg. He opened it, read silently. His brows furrowed. The statement detailed the misuse of the fundraiser language, the removal of original donations from the record, the editing of public posts after I stepped down from the board, all supported by screenshots and timestamps. Greg looked up, eyes narrowing. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Carson shifted in his seat. Amelia's hand tightened on her wineglass. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was truth. Documented, silent, irrefutable. I stood. "Thank you for dinner," I said. Then I walked out. Outside, the air was cooler than expected. A soft wind moved through the trees lining their cul-de-sac. I got into my car and drove, not to my house, but to the foundation building. It was late, but Diane was still there. She met me with tired eyes and open arms. "You went," she said. I nodded. She gestured to the conference room. On the wall, a large mock-up of our Summer Literacy Initiative banner had just been delivered. There was Jonah's drawing front and center, the one he made during his recovery, a sketch of a turtle reading under a tree. I looked at it for a long time. Then I said, "It's time we moved forward without their shadows." Diane agreed. We finalized the paperwork that night. Carson and Amelia were removed from the advisory board, with cause. The foundation would now be run by a rotating group of educators, single mothers, and retired community organizers. No family names, no dynasties, just service. The next day, I mailed a letter to Jonah. Not through his parents, direct to his school, where Diane's friend worked in administration. Inside was a simple note. "I'm still here. Whenever you're ready." And with it, I included a photograph. One of the two of us, back when he was 5, building a Lego rocket on the living room floor. I didn't expect an answer, but I sent it anyway. Because sometimes the only thing louder than silence is quiet truth, sent with love and no demand for return. And that, I realized, was my victory. The week after that dinner, the air felt different around me. Not clearer, not lighter, just still. I thought the aftermath would be more dramatic. Some angry call from Carson, some veiled email from Amelia. But there was nothing, only quiet. As if my decision to hand the truth to Greg had struck a chord so deep they didn't know how to respond. For once, their silence wasn't a weapon. It was fear. I spent more time at the foundation in the following days, not to escape, but to root myself back into the purpose I had almost forgotten. Diane and I worked with a new team of volunteers, women from all kinds of backgrounds, retired nurses, single grandmothers. One woman, Pam, had just come out of a difficult divorce and brought with her a kind of determination I hadn't seen in a long time. There were meetings, letters to donors, a new structure for the advisory panel. But even with all the movement, I couldn't stop thinking about Jonah. The photo I sent. The letter. I kept checking the mailbox like some lovesick teenager. I told myself not to expect a response. And still, every envelope with my name on it made my breath catch. Then it came. 10 days after the dinner. A plain white envelope, no return address. My name written in shaky block letters. I sat on the front steps and opened it right there, as if my body refused to wait. Inside was a drawing, a new one. A turtle again. But this time he was sitting beneath a tree next to a smaller turtle. They weren't reading. They were just sitting, staring at the sky. On the bottom, 2 words, not signed, still here. I held it to my chest for a long time, not crying, not breaking down, just breathing in the simple power of being seen. That drawing gave me something I didn't know I had lost. Hope. In the days that followed, I found myself letting go of the bitterness in small ways. I donated the old gala gowns I had kept out of nostalgia. I cleared the garage of boxes I had avoided for years. I even made peace with the idea that Jonah might never say the words I had longed for. He had drawn them instead. And that was enough. One morning, Pam walked into the office with a question about logistics for the summer retreat. I told her to wait while I found the binder. But as I turned toward the shelf, something clicked in my mind. Retreat. Jonah's at the old school hosted retreats for youth recovering from surgeries, art therapy, nature walks, journaling sessions with specialists. He used to love those. It was the only time I had seen him truly forget his pain. I found the contact and made a call. The director remembered me. We arranged a sponsorship plan. We would cover fees for 30 children that summer, including transportation and supplies. No fanfare, no publicity, just quiet healing. When I told Diane, she squeezed my hand. This was always what it was supposed to be, she said. The week the retreat launched, I received a letter from the director, a thank you card signed by all 30 kids. Inside was a photograph. There in the back row, wearing a green sweatshirt, was Jonah. He wasn't smiling, but he was there, alive, present, participating. And for me, that was the miracle. That same evening, as I was walking back to my car, I saw Carson standing outside the building, his hands in his pockets, looking thinner than I remembered. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded. I waited. He spoke slowly, said he had been let go from his firm, that Greg had questioned the foundation's paperwork and found inconsistencies, said Amelia had gone to stay with her sister, said he didn't know where Jonah had gone. I didn't flinch. I told him Jonah was safe, that I wouldn't give him any more details. He looked at me, searching for anger, for blame. I didn't give him that either. I said, "You made your choices. I made mine." He nodded again. As I turned to leave, he asked if there was any way to make it right. I paused for just a second. Then I said, "Not for me, but maybe for your son," and I walked away. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. Not because I had punished them, not because I had exposed them, but because I had finally stopped begging to be part of a family that didn't want me. The real family, I realized, was already around me. The women in the foundation, the kids in the program, the neighbors who left soup on my porch during Jonah's surgery, the young volunteers who called me Miss M like it was a badge of honor, and maybe, just maybe, Jonah again, in his own way. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the stars come out one by one. The air smelled like rain, the kind of summer rain that washes away not just dirt, but doubt. In the quiet, I whispered a thank you to myself for surviving, and to the silence for teaching me the language of truth. By mid-August, the days grew longer, but inside me, things felt quieter. It wasn't the kind of quiet that used to hurt. This one felt earned, like the silence after a long piece of music where you finally get to exhale. I started waking up earlier, not because I had things to do, but because I wanted to. I walked every morning around the lake trail behind the old library, the one Jonah and I used to circle when he was still small enough to hold my hand without hesitation. I let myself remember those days without sadness, just memory, gentle and honest. Jonah hadn't written again, but I didn't expect him to. His presence at the retreat was more than I could have asked for, and the drawing was more than enough to tell me he hadn't forgotten who I was. That was something Carson and Amelia could never take away. Around the foundation, the buzz of new projects kept everyone busy. Diane had proposed a mentorship program, pairing younger women in training with those who had rebuilt their lives after years of struggle. It wasn't just inspiring, it was necessary. For every story like mine, there were a dozen more women trying to find their footing after being told their worth depended on their usefulness. One afternoon, I found a small bouquet on my porch, daisies and lavender wrapped in brown paper. No note. I looked up and down the street, half expecting someone to wave from a car window. No one was there. I brought the flowers inside and placed them in a mason jar on the kitchen table. The scent reminded me of a summer market in Vermont, years ago, when Jonah had used his allowance to buy a single stem for me. He had said, "You always smell like peace." I never asked what that meant. Maybe now I understood. Later that week, I was asked to speak at a local event, a women's luncheon hosted by the town's business council. I almost said no. Not because I was nervous, but because I didn't want to become someone who performed her pain for applause. But Diane gently reminded me, "You're not performing. You're planting seeds." So I agreed. When I stood at that podium, looking out at the sea of faces, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, teachers, nurses, I felt something shift inside me. I told them about resilience, not the kind that roars, the kind that listens, the kind that stays standing when everyone has turned their backs. I told them how easy it was to lose your voice when the people you love treat you like background noise, and how sacred it is when you learn to speak again, not to be heard, but to be whole. When I stepped down, a young woman approached me. Her eyes were wet, but her hands were steady. She said, "You reminded me of my grandmother. She raised me, and I never told her thank you. She passed before I could. But listening to you made me feel like maybe she heard it anyway." I didn't have the words to respond, so I hugged her. That was enough. As the crowd emptied and the catering crew packed up the tables, I lingered near the back door. The sun was low, turning the parking lot gold. I saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench under the trees. Greg. He stood as I approached. He looked tired. Not unwell, but tired in the way people do when they've seen too much and spoken too little. He said he wanted to apologize, not for investigating Carson. He stood by that decision, but for doubting me, for assuming that silence meant complicity. I told him it was all right, because he was right to look closely. That's what good people do when the stakes are high. He smiled faintly and handed me a folder. Inside were documents, finalized transfers, property revisions, a new charter for the foundation. Everything I had requested was official. It was done. He said, "This foundation is going to outlive both of us, and maybe that's the point." We didn't say much more, just sat for a while under the trees. Two people who had watched a fire and chosen not to run, but to rebuild. That evening, I stood at the front window of my home and looked out at the neighborhood. The wind lifted the curtain just enough to let in the scent of pine. I felt no need to explain myself to anyone anymore. The woman I was a year ago might have waited for a knock at the door, a phone call, some olive branch from Carson or Amelia, but now I only waited for morning, because in the morning the work would begin again, and this time it belonged to me. Fall crept in quietly. The leaves turned gold, then red, then let go. I watched them fall each morning from the porch, wrapped in the same cardigan I used to wear when waiting outside Jonah's school. The days settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Not busy, not loud, just mine. Diane stopped by with a small folder. Inside were thank you letters, dozens of them. Women from the Foundation's first cohort had written about their progress. One had enrolled in culinary school. Another opened a small landscaping business. A third wrote that she finally felt safe enough to sleep through the night. I held the folder against my chest and exhaled. This was why I had stayed silent until the right moment. This was why I didn't shout. The results were louder than any scream could have been. One morning I drove to the bay, the same one where Carson once suggested we retire together. I hadn't been back since that conversation. The shoreline hadn't changed. The waves still curled in, softly, rhythmically, like breath. I sat on a bench near the lighthouse. For the first time in months, I thought of Carson without anger, without ache, just as someone I once knew well, someone who made choices, and I had made mine. Behind me, a little girl ran up to her grandmother, shrieking with delight about the shells she had found. The older woman bent low, listening intently, nodding like every word mattered. I smiled at that. It reminded me of who I used to be and who I had become again. At home, I received an envelope with Jonah's handwriting. Inside was a photo. Him, standing in front of a non-profit office in Portland. He was smiling. Behind him was a mural that read, "You are more than what they said you were." On the back, he wrote, "Thank you for teaching me how to leave when staying would have meant forgetting who I was. I love you." I placed the photo in a wooden frame and set it by the kitchen window, beside the daisies and lavender now dried and papery. Every time I passed it, I felt something quiet and warm grow in my chest. Weeks later, the town invited me to a small ceremony. Nothing grand, just a local recognition for community work. I almost said no. I didn't need applause. But Diane insisted. They gave me a plaque, but I didn't keep it. Instead, I asked them to hang it in the foundation's main office, right above the door. Because it wasn't really about me. It was about every woman who had ever been told she was too much, too old, too complicated, too expensive, too inconvenient. It was about the quiet kind of dignity, the kind you don't have to explain, the kind you don't have to beg for. I ended that day with tea and silence. The good kind. The kind that tells you everything has shifted and settled into its right place. I didn't need their permission to live well anymore, and I didn't need to forgive them in order to be free, because I had chosen peace, not as a retreat, but as a declaration. If this story echoed something within you, even if just a whisper, you're not alone. We all have chapters we never expected to write, but sometimes the quietest ones carry the most power. Have you ever chosen dignity over noise, silence over explanation? Share your thoughts. This space belongs to us all, to every woman who has walked through fire and decided not to burn, but to build.